So today we're going to talk about the effect of migration on religious demography. So over 20% of the population in Canada was born overseas. In Ontario, that's actually closer to 30%. In the UK, 1 in 8 people were born overseas, and in the US, about a quarter of the population is foreign born. So before we talk about some of these concepts, I want us to define our terms. So according to the UN, an international migrant is someone who has been living for 1 year in a country, 1 year or longer in a country other than the one in which they were born. So for example, I was born in the United States, but I have been living for more than 1 year in Canada. So according to the UN, I am an international migrant. Now, you can see by that definition that a lot of foreign workers, international students might be counted as international migrants. So additionally, the UN considers refugees, and in some cases, their descendants, for example, Palestinian refugees who were born in refugee camps, as international migrants. So migrants have both an origin, so a country that they're coming from, and a destination, so a country that they're going to. We often call these sending and receiving countries. So international migrants can be viewed from 2 directions, either as an immigrant, E-M-I-G-R-A-N-T, leaving an origin country, or as an immigrant, so someone entering a destination country. Now, about 3% of the world's population has migrated across international borders, and that might seem like a small percentage, but it actually represents a lot of people. So if the world's 214 million international migrants were counted as one nation, they would actually constitute the 5th most populous country on the globe, just behind Indonesia and ahead of Brazil. So in Canada, Canada became the first country to adopt a point system for immigrants. So previous immigration policy in Canada had actually given preference to immigrants from the United Kingdom, from Western Europe, from other majority white countries such as the US, Australia, New Zealand. But under regulations that were brought in the late 1960s by the Pearson government at the time, this was during Canada's centennial year, Canadian immigration officers were no longer supposed to discriminate on the basis of race. So the new policy assigned points to people based on things like language fluency, education, job skills, and it also made it easier for people who were already here to sponsor relatives from abroad. So after this change, thousands of new skilled immigrants arrived in Canada, primarily, though not exclusively, from Commonwealth countries such as India, Pakistan, Hong Kong, Jamaica, Trinidad, Ghana, Nigeria. But the new rules didn't help everyone. Because this was a point system, it was geared to recruit professionals. So there were lots of nurses, teachers, doctors, professors, engineers. You had to be highly educated. So the points model didn't cause an immediate change in Canada's demographic makeup. The real seismic shift didn't happen until the 1980s. And this was because of the establishment of the Immigration Act, which took effect in 1978. And it established for the first time in law the main objectives of Canadian immigration policy. And those included the promotion of things like economic, social, and cultural goals, as well as prioritizing family reunion, diversity, and non-discrimination. It was also for the first time that the Immigration Act actually defined refugees as a distinct group of immigrants in Canadian law, and required the government to meet its obligations under international agreements. So Canada's demographic makeup, like so many predominantly English-speaking countries, has changed significantly because of immigration policy over the last 50 years. But what do we know of anything about the religious faith of the people who are migrating? Well, we know lots about the immigrants in terms of their countries of origin, their socioeconomic backgrounds, labor force participation, their education, their family patterns, but we know very little often about their religious patterns, and that's because of several reasons. So first of all, there's often a lack of good data. So here in Canada, as well as in the UK and Australia, we actually have pretty good data because we ask people about religion on the census. Now, in the United States, which is where most of the scholarly work on religion and immigration is done, immigration researchers rely primarily on data gathered by governmental agencies, and those agencies are restricted from asking participants questions about their religious affiliation. The second issue is that it's often insiders in a particular group who study that group. And many immigrant groups lack a critical mass of scholars who are studying those groups, whether they're interested in religion or whether they're just working in academia, period. A third explanation is that there's often an anti-religion bias that exists in much of the social sciences, based on the assumption that, well, religion deals with value-laden issues and we can't study it empirically, which we know is not correct. But there have been studies done. So in 2012, the Pew Center Forum for Religion and Public Life, they conducted a very important survey using data from all countries that had available information on religion. So what they found was very interesting. So what religion do you think comprises most of the world's nearly 214 international migrants? If you said Christianity, you would be correct. So Christians comprise nearly half, an estimated 106 million or 49% of international migrants. Muslims make up the second largest group, almost 60 million or 27%. And the remaining quarter are a mix of Hindus, Buddhists, Jews, adherents of other faiths, and those who are religiously unaffiliated. So they might identify as atheists or agnostics or say they have no particular religion. So in some respects, the religious affiliation of migrants mirrors the religious composition of the world's population. For example, Christians and Muslims are the two largest religious groups among migrants, as well as the two largest religious groups in general. But Christians comprise a much greater share of migrants than they do of the general population. On the other hand, some religious groups are underrepresented among migrants. For example, Hindus. Hindus comprise about 5% of international migrants, even though they're 10 to 15% of the global population. Now, in percentage terms, Jews have by far the highest level of migration. About 1/4 of Jews alive today have left the country in which they were born and now live somewhere else. By contrast, just 5% of Christians, 4% of Muslims, and fewer than 3% of other major religious groups have migrated across international borders. So here in this slide, you can see the top, there we go, the top countries of origin for migrants in each religious group. You can see Mexico is the largest country of origin, and this was done a few years ago, so things have changed slightly. And that is why the majority there would be Christian coming out of Mexico, Muslim coming out of the Palestinian territories. We have Russian Jews, most unaffiliated and other religions are coming out of China. And then the top destination countries for migrants in each religious group. So most Christians from Mexico in particular are headed to the United States. We have Jewish migrants to Israel. Muslims, the largest receiving country would be Saudi Arabia, India for Hindus, and other religious groups in Hong Kong. So what do we know about where these migrants settle? Again, I just want to give you some context about why we're thinking about religion and the city in terms of migration in this class. So the geographic distribution of the immigrant and Canadian-born population in Canada is very different. So most immigrants in Canada live in large cities, and their concentration in large cities has been increasing. So more than 60% of overall immigrants and 70% of recent immigrants to Canada live in Canada's three largest cities, so Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. So cities are the prime sites where migrant lives are lived. So if we're to understand migration and global flows of people, we have to understand the ways in which migrants use religion, religious practices, religious institutions to shape their lives. In reflecting on earlier waves of immigrants who came to America, Will Herberg, who is a sociologist in the 1960s, did one of the earlier studies of migrant adaptation. And he argued that even though migrants were expected to give up virtually everything they brought with them, so they were expected to give up their language, their nationality, their manner of life, they weren't always expected to give up their religion. In fact, what he said was, religious identity often replaced ethnic identity for them and became more important to them in their new country than it was in their homeland. Now, we find similar patterns that exist for immigrants who've come since the 1960s and 70s, and much of the research, primarily coming out of the United States, shows that migrants are actually more religious post-migration than they were prior to migration. So I want us to look at why that might be by examining the 3 R's that scholars like Charles Hirschman, who's a sociologist at the University of Washington in the US, say that religious communities offer migrants. And those 3 R's are refuge, respect, and resources. So I'm going to look at each of these in turn. And the first one is refuge. So international migration. Even in this age of instant communication and inexpensive travel, is a traumatizing experience because it is about rupture from what you once knew, perhaps from family, from familiar landscape, to something completely unknown. So if you've ever spent time abroad, you may have found yourself wandering into a grocery store looking for something that tasted and looked familiar to you. I once paid $20 for a can of pumpkin in Sydney, Australia, because I was desperate to make a pumpkin pie for Thanksgiving, because that to me just felt like home. Now, immigrants become strangers in a new land where they've essentially lost familiar sounds, sights, smells. They've lost the expectations of customary behavior, hearing their native language. They've lost support from friends and family that can't be taken for granted any longer. So even the most routine activities of everyday life, shopping for food, leisure time pursuits, those can all be very alienating experiences for many new immigrants who arrive in a new place. And those sorts of mental strains are often very difficult to navigate. So it's no wonder, really, that immigrants would navigate to the familiar, whether that's residence in ethnic neighborhoods, employment in ethnic enclave firms, or social pursuits in the company of family and friends who are from the same ethnic background. And in the same way, religious beliefs and practices can serve as a refuge for immigrants as they struggle with the navigation of all of this sort of difference in their lives. So Will Herberg, as I mentioned before, he wrote a book in the 1960s, Protestant Catholic Jew, an essay in American religious sociology, and he claimed that immigrants must confront the essential existential question of who am I? So in a new social context, immigrants could often find meaning and identity. So in that sort of rupture from what they were before to what they are in their new country, that answering that question of who am I, they often found an answer to that by reaffirming traditional religious beliefs and reaffirming their religious faith when it may have been taken for granted before. So, for example, if you are a Hindu in India, that's not something that you need to think about on a day-to-day basis, right? You may take it for granted that you can find a temple on, every other street corner, that you can do what you need to do or get what you need to get to perform puja, for example, in your house. But when you're a migrant abroad, you have to be very intentional about your religious practice and your religious community. You don't take it for granted. Herberg also found that the sort of certainty of religious teachings, religious precepts can also help to serve as an anchor for immigrants as they adapt to other changes in their lives. This might be support for traditional beliefs and patterns, things like intergenerational obligations, gender hierarchies, customary familial practices, things that they might believe are threatened by adaptation to the larger culture. And things like hearing your prayers in a native tongue, those sorts of things, doing rituals that you did in your childhood, they provide an emotional connection, especially when they're shared with others in a group. So for immigrants who are separated from their homeland, religious membership may also offer a refuge in the sense that it creates a sense of belonging and participation. Should go back here. There we go. They offer a sense of refuge in that it creates a sense of belonging and participation in the face of what may be a loss of identity, or even discrimination within the broader community. Because religious organizations provide a community where immigrants gather and form networks of mutual support, they often provide psychological support to counter discrimination that people are experiencing in the broader community. And indeed, often in congregations, an ethnic identity is nurtured and strengthened. So much has been written by scholars about the way that immigrants use religious institutions to reproduce and to reassert important aspects of culture from their home countries. For example, incorporating ethnic practices into religious ceremonies. But how exactly do immigrant religious institutions actually work to reproduce this shared identity? So two of the major strategies that religious groups use for maintaining and passing on cultural values, norms, and practices are collective memory and symbolic rituals. So collective memory is the term for the memories of a group of people who have collected them through shared social experiences. So for those of you who celebrate Christmas, maybe when you smell an evergreen tree, that evokes the smell of a Christmas tree in your house, decorated and brightly lit, and you might also recall the smell of baked goods that your family would make, and maybe you'd even hear particular music when you smell this. So these strong memories are collective memories. They're ones that have been contributed to and shared by others. The term collective memory was coined by Maurice Halbach, who's a sociologist, and he argued that all of our personal memories are recorded through the filter of our collective and social memories. Now, collective memory is enhanced because we conserve history. So you think of all of the recent controversies here in Canada and the United States, around the world, around the issue of statues and what they represent. So statues represent a collective memory. They're a story that we tell ourselves about who we are as a people, right? And in that same way, religious symbols, religious buildings, books are all references tying us to past generations and shaping our memories. So collective memory is found in religious groups when groups share information about the past and construct meanings about the past together. And this can be done through the creation of monuments through storytelling, which serves not only to remind people of past events, but also to help define the group in the present moment. Often collective memory is enacted through symbolic rituals, and this might take place within the family. For example, the lighting of the Shabbat or Sabbath candles on Friday night by a Jewish family. That's a way to commemorate what has gone before and who that family is now as part of the larger Jewish community. In addition to happening in the family, it might also take place in the broader community. For example, it might be a public ritual, and the picture that I've given you here is of the Festa celebration that the Maltese community holds in Toronto annually. It's a wonderful example of collective memory and action. This is a feast of the Holy Christ of Miracles. It's the biggest feast that happens annually in the Azores, the islands in Portugal, and it's held the 5th Sunday after Easter. So it dates back to the end of the 17th century in the Azores. It's a religious veneration associated with an image of Jesus that's displayed in the Sanctuary of the Lord Holy Christ, which is on the island of São Miguel. So during the Festa, in the Azores, the statue is brought out of the church. Thousands of faithful who come from every island in the Azores and Azorean communities which are spread throughout the world have come for this. They process around behind the statue. So many Maltese migrants time their return visits to Malta for this particular festival. But for those who can't be in Malta during the festival, one way to symbolically participate in the festival occurring in the Azores is to participate in a local version of the festival. So this picture is the Holy Christ of Miracles procession that's been running out of St. Mary's Church on Bathurst since 1966. It's among one of the largest Portuguese festivals in Canada. It draws people from across the country and from the large Azorean diaspora in the US and Canada. At its peak, it's nowhere near this now, but at its peak in the 1970s, it attracted more than 90,000 people. So it allows the community to continue to reenact this very important story, to tell its story of itself, not only to its members, but also to the larger community as well. And it connects those who've migrated from the Azores to their home. Another method of reproducing ethnic identity is through the use of native languages. So these might be offered in a formal language class or a Sunday school class. Many of you have probably gone to language classes. Maybe your parents forced you to go to a language class at your mosque or your temple. All of this was a way of reproducing ethnic and religious identity. Now, language in immigrant congregations is often a very highly contested issue. It's one that poses dilemmas. On the one hand, the use of language from a country of origin enhances a sense of commitment and comfort for immigrants. Right? On the other hand, differences in native language and in dialects of the same language, often that constitutes the basis for segregation among congregational members, and not infrequently for intergenerational strains and tensions. So perhaps the younger generation in that particular congregation do not speak the native language any longer, they speak English, and the older generation would like to continue to have their services in their native language. A major issue usually revolves around the language that's used in the worship service. So for some religious traditions, for example, if you're a Greek Orthodox or Zoroastrian, Hindu, Muslim, it's going to require that the worship service be conducted in a holy language. So that's not up for debate. But other religious groups, for example, Christian churches, many Buddhist temples, allow for vernacular and local languages. So congregations have to decide which language is going to be used, for example, when there are multiple ethnic groups involved in a congregation or when there are multiple generations involved in a congregation. So the use of different languages and different worship services in the same congregation has led to what has been called parallel congregations within one congregation. Even when there is, instances when English is used as a language for formal worship services, often what we find is that there's a very strong tendency for native language speakers to self-segregate at social and other informal occasions held at the religious site as well. Another major way that congregations reproduce ethnicity is by physically reproducing aspects of their home country religious structures, such as temples, pagodas, golden domes, statues, the use of native construction materials. Many immigrant groups go to great effort and expense to import building materials. They might import architects, artisans to actually recreate physical structures from their home country. So this temple, mosque, whatever Gurdwara building itself is a point of pride. It's a public representation of cultural solidarity to the broader community. But those religious symbols can also become a vehicle for expressing migrants' nostalgia for ways of life before migration. And it has been argued by some scholars that the temple space actually becomes a substitute for, nostalgically, for the home space. This is the BAPS Sri Swaminarayan Mandir out near Etobicoke. It is Canada's first traditionally hand-carved stone mandir. It's built according to the principles of ancient Indian Shastras, which are principles of architecture. So more than 2,000 Indian craftsmen and about 400 volunteers from Toronto's Hindu community worked on the construction of this temple for more than a year. The cost was about $40 million. They used Turkish limestone and Carrara marble, which they actually had shipped to small villages in India first. They had craftsmen in these villages actually painstakingly carve this Carrara marble in India, and then the individual pieces, so all 24,000 of them, were labeled with barcodes and shipped by container to Toronto, where they were reassembled. And the chief engineer was actually a Hindu monk named Akshav Muni Swami. So the second R of these three R's is respect. Religious groups provide an alternative sort of respectability for newcomers, something that is particularly important for those who feel that they are denied social recognition in the host country, or who may have even suffered downward occupational mobility as a result of migration. So if you were a doctor or an urban planner in Bangladesh, but now you're a taxi driver in Toronto, you have experienced what we would call downward social mobility. However, being a good Christian or Muslim or Buddhist brings respect within that particular community and often the wider ethnic community as well. There are also often within religious groups, typically opportunities for leadership and service that bring prestige. Because membership becomes a conscious choice when you're in Canada, the UK, US, Australia, right? So there's not a mosque or temple on every corner. Immigrant religious institutions have to actively recruit members, right? That you have to be very conscientious about which one you're going to join. And because immigrant congregations are often built from scratch, they assume and create leadership roles that were not even thought of in their country of origin. I found this when I was doing research on a Swaminarayan Hindu group in Australia, in Sydney, Australia, where women were given roles that would have typically been assigned to a Hindu priest back in Gujarat and in India. But in Sydney, because they needed people to do things and they didn't have a lot of people there, women would often perform these tasks. So these skills of leadership and social capital that migrants gain in their new congregations are often transferable into broader society. So they give migrants confidence in their workplace, in shops, in civic arenas. The other important thing that, that congregations do in terms of respect is that migrant religious communities often guide their members about their collective rights and responsibilities. For example, work that's been done on ethnic Catholic churches in the United States, such as Irish, Brazilian, Dominican, migrant Catholic churches, shows that migrants who may be particularly vulnerable because of their immigration status become part of these very powerful, resource-rich networks that are potential venues for protection and representation of these migrants. So, for example, when a Dominican migrant attends church, they learn about these social and legal services that are available to them, or they might work with them to regularize their legal status. So the final R is resources. So in addition to the psychological, spiritual benefits of religious practice for immigrants, the social organization of churches, synagogues, temples actually also serves the very practical material needs of immigrants when they first arrive. So when an immigrant arrives in a new country, they need to find housing and employment, they need to enroll their children in schools, they need to learn or improve their language skills, they need to begin to create a new social life. So religious institutions are one of the most important sources of support for aiding with these issues. And here's one example in this picture that I've given you. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, refugees from Laos settled in rural Louisiana. This is in Iberia Parish. And there was a federally supported program for training workers in the oil fields there, so it drew many Laotian refugees. At first, the newcomers lived in public housing, but over time, they started settling in clusters in middle-class neighborhoods. And then by 1986, the leaders of the community joined together to form an association, and they built a Lao-style Buddhist temple in a rural area of the county. After they did that, soon residential clusters started forming around the temple. This became a residential settlement for many Lao families. So in addition to providing cultural and spiritual continuity with their past, the temple also served as a communication hub for economic opportunities. As part of their research on the Lao community, Zhao, Bangston, and Kim, and I've given you all the references that I'm mentioning at the end of this presentation, they interviewed a non-Lao director of a firm that employed about 75 Laotians as welders, fitters, craftsmen. They were working to construct offshore oil rigs. And they asked him how the firm got so many Lao workers. And the director replied that one of his foremen was actually the financial manager for the Buddhist temple. And when people would go to this man looking for a job, he'd refer them to this particular firm. They also had another member of the temple community who provided assistance for housing through a position as a loan officer in a bank. So you often see this in immigrant congregations where people are receiving information about housing, banking, language classes, childcare, all of these sort of practical needs which are being met through the local immigrant congregation. So studies have found that religion and local congregations helps to sort of mediate the adaptation process of immigrants, making them less likely to abandon the faith that they might have left their homeland with. But do we know if what we have found out about the United States actually holds true for Canada? So we do have some research that's been done in this area. Philip Connor, who's a sociologist at Princeton, has looked specifically at the issue of immigrant religiosity in Canada. He wanted to address the limitation of assessing immigrant religiosity by just seeing were they members or did they attend a religious service. So he used different measures. He looked at whether they participated in a religious group, whether they were formally members of a religious group, and whether they actually volunteered with a religious group. He used data from what's called the Longitudinal Survey of Immigrants to Canada, which is a survey administered by Statistics Canada, which began in the early 2000s, which studies immigrants to Canada over a 10-year period and checks in with them at different periods of time and asks them questions over that 10-year period. So he used the data from the longitudinal survey, but he also conducted interviews as well. And what he found was interesting. So he found that religious group membership rises during the first few years after migrations. So when migrants first arrive, they are more likely to formally join a religious group. But he found that participation in the religious group declines over time among immigrants. And at the same time, he found the likelihood of religious volunteerism increases. So at the same time that they're actually participating less in formal religious meetings, institutional meetings, they're actually volunteering more as part of their religious practice. Now, a rise in religious group membership a few years after migration could be a result of some of these material socioeconomic benefits that we've just discussed, the things that religious organizations provide to members, right? So maybe they're getting information on employment, housing, education, medical services. So all of these sort of things that ease immigrant adjustment in those first few years. So that makes sense. But why does migrant religious participation decline over time, even if they still remain members? So their membership remains constant. One theory is that it's because their participation actually starts to mirror what happens in broader Canadian society. So often immigrant religious groups, and we'll be talking about this over the course of the semester, adapt to the congregational forms of organization that many majority Protestant congregations would use. For example, only meeting once a week, adapting around Monday to Friday work schedules, right? So migrants conform their religious practices to that of the dominant society. But then there's this third finding that even though their participation decreases over time, that they actually tend to volunteer more with their immigrant religious organizations as time goes on. So what we think that means is that as those initial pressures over things like cultural stress, language skills, employment difficulties, as those things subside, religious volunteerism is more feasible. So that increase in volunteerism, coupled with a decrease in religious participation, could also suggest that immigrants are more selective in their religious activity over time. For example, maybe they emphasize special holidays or religious festivals that require lots of volunteer help over regular group participation week in and week out. A further way that religious congregations have been important in cities in Canada is through the way that they've shaped urban spaces. And this is through what have been called faith-based ethnic neighborhoods. Work on this has been done by a scholar named Sandeep Agrawal. He's the director of urban planning at the University of Alberta. And he has looked at the way that faith-based ethnic neighborhoods are growing rapidly across not just the GTA, but also other metropolitan areas of Canada. So faith-based ethnic neighborhoods are residential communities that develop around places of worship. They're inhabited primarily by congregants of one faith who may or may not be of a single ethnic origin. Now, typically, say in the 1950s, 60s, you may have had this sort of thing that developed around a Catholic or Protestant church. So you have the idea of the parish, right, where everyone could walk to the local parish. But recently we've seen this idea, resurgence of this idea, but mainly among the ethnic groups that are followers of non-Christian religions, such as Islam, Hinduism, and Sikhism. So many of these religious groups grow organically. Some are planned. Planned faith communities are those that are planned and built near a religious institution, usually by the institution itself or in concert with a builder. We have an example of this in the Peace Village in Bonn with the Ahmadiyya Mosque that's there. And then we have concentrations that grow organically, and this is more typical. So you might have a few new or existing homes, or even as large as a subdivision around a place of worship. And then people of corresponding faith to that place of worship gradually and incrementally move in and build up to form the majority. So this was a map of the neighborhoods that Agrawal studied. He focused on 4 organically evolved ethnic communities, South Asian, Italian, and Jewish, based on 4 major religious groups, Islam, Sikhism, Catholic, and Judaism in the GTA. He looked at them because they provided an even geographic spread across the GTA, and they were both urban and suburban neighborhoods. And he did surveys of residents in the subdivisions that were located near these places of worship. He was interested in things like, why did you move there? Is there a sense of neighborliness in the neighborhood? And these sorts of things. So he looked at the Nugget Avenue neighborhood. This was one of the ones he looked at. This is the residential area that's across from the Islamic Foundation Mosque on the intersection of Nugget Avenue and Markham Road in Scarborough. So this is a good example of a faith-based neighborhood. This neighborhood consists mostly of single-family homes located across from this 3-story high mosque. It has a 125-foot minaret, which dominates the skyline there. The mosque was built in 1991 after a long public planning debate. It contains a prayer hall, library, gymnasium, mortuary, Islamic school classes, meeting rooms, cafeteria, 200 parking spaces. And there's a very strong Islamic identity that's printed on the landscape of the neighborhood. Most of the neighborhood it's a typical suburban community, relatively young homeowners who are new to the area, so most of them have lived there for less than 5 to 6 years on average. Most all immigrants of Muslim, South Asian background, slightly larger households by Canadian norms, and the proximity of the mosque, according to Agrawal, seems to have actually strongly shaped the formation of this neighborhood. But what he found, so even though there was a concentration of Muslims living within the area of the mosque, was that 40% of the residents in the area were actually Italian. So it wasn't completely Muslim, South Asian in this neighborhood. 40% of the residents were actually Italian because it had once been an Italian neighborhood, and many of them continued to live side by side with their Muslim neighbors. And Agrawal also found that the Muslims who lived in the neighborhood were of diverse ethnic backgrounds. So they were Pakistanis, Indians, Guyanese. He was interested in the relationship of the mosque and the neighborhood because the Islamic Foundation in particular is not only a mosque, but it's a community center. So it offers children's programs, women's groups, facilities for community events, so on. So he asked people what activities they actually did at the mosque. And an overwhelming majority of the Muslims that he interviewed said that their primary use was for prayers, followed by community meetings and children's programs. When respondents were asked why they chose to live in that neighborhood, what surprised Agrawal was they didn't say it was because the mosque was there. They said it was affordable, convenient, and near various services. So the majority did not say that they moved there specifically for the mosque, but because it was affordable, convenient, and near services. But 70% of the Muslims he interviewed said that proximity to the mosque was a draw amongst all of the others. But when he said, would you have moved here if there was no mosque? Only 23% of the respondents said they would not have moved there if there was no mosque. So people liked living in the area and did not think it necessarily had to do with the mosque being there or not being there. So the findings were similar for the Morningstar Drive neighborhood. This neighborhood also has a high concentration of a religious group, in this case Sikhs, near its place of worship, which is the Sri Guru Singh Maltan Gurdwara. So this is also what we would call a faith-based community. The neighborhood extends over a few blocks, including a cluster of subdivisions. The Gurdwara itself is a converted high school building along Airport Road. It's near Pearson Airport. Some of you have probably seen it, or maybe you might be a member there. It was established in the 1980s, and it spawned the movement of Sikhs into the residential subdivision of single-family homes and duplexes, which again had once largely been inhabited by Italians. About 32% of the population in the neighborhood is Sikh, but 30% are Roman Catholic, indicating that there still is that large Italian population in the area. The striking presence of the Gurdwara gives the neighborhood the reputation of being a Sikh area. That image is reinforced by the presence of Indian strip malls that are nearby. The Gurdwara, just like the mosque in the Nugget Avenue neighborhood, offers not only religious services, but also community services. So it's a gathering place, it's a center for family and children services, language classes, sports. So it serves Sikhs from far and wide, not just from the immediate neighborhood. What Agrawal found was that the Gurdwara didn't seem to be this sort of all-encompassing neighborhood institution. It linked Sikhs together, but it didn't displace other sorts of neighborly networks. The people who were interviewed said that the Gurdwara was an attraction